All right, so what we've had a chance to do is kind of take a broad overview of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so, what we told you is that this is going to be something that we just continue to come back to again and again. We're going to take a deep dive into all three articles of the Constitution. And then, um, as we do that, one of the things we're going to be bringing up are the amendments. Right now, we saw the Bill of Rights was those first 10 uh, preloaded amendments that were part of the ratification process, and we want to look at the other 17 times in our history that the Constitution has been changed. So we're going to break down amendments 11 through 27 real quick. Just kind of take a look. Some of them are going to be ones that we hit in other units as we're going through, and some of them it's just be like, hey, that's cool, that's in the Constitution, and we're never going to speak of them again. But this way, you've got at least a passing familiarity with with what's going on with these amendments. Now, let's talk real quick about how the Constitution can be changed. Now, remember, those first 10 amendments were part of the ratification process. There are two ways we can change the Constitution. The first way is the way that's been used. There's nothing that says way two can't be used, it just never has been in our history. The first avenue of change is two-thirds of both houses of Congress have to agree on an amendment, and then it goes out to the states, and then three-quarters of the states have to agree to the amendment. Now that should sound like quite a bit, right? Especially in the polarized political environment we're in right now, it would be extremely hard to get anybody to agree to or to get that many people to agree to any one amendment. And that's the point. They didn't want um, the Constitution change process to be too easy. They wanted it to be a difficult hurdle to overcome. That way, you wouldn't have frivolous amendments being passed. And so that's the way that it happens now. Um, we can also have what's called an Article 5 convention. Article 5 says that there can be, the states can call a constitutional convention where they sit down and look at an amendment or multiple amendments too. I'm not going to deep dive into that. If you're real interested in that, you look up Article 5 conventions, and there's some different legal wrangling on what they think would be fair and what they think wouldn't be fair, but probably more depth than we want to get into here. There have been 33 proposed amendments. Of those 33 proposed amendments, 27 have passed, right? Probably the most famous one that hasn't passed, at least nearest your lifetime, is the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s. Um, the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have outlawed discrimination based on gender, um, went out and fell a couple of states short of the required number to pass. Most amendments today, or recent amendments, have been written with deadlines. It's basically the idea is okay, we're going to approve this amendment, and then the amendment has to be adopted within 5 years or 7 years. And that's what happened to the ERA. It had a deadline on it, and by the deadline, not enough states had agreed with the amendment for it to become um, part of the Constitution. Now, the 11th Amendment, and this is an actual drawing of them. No, I'm just kidding. This is just kind of a goofy drawing. The 11th Amendment basically says that people can't sue other states or states that they don't live in. It's been expanded to say that people can't sue the states. And so you can't take a state to federal court, at least according to the 11th Amendment. The 12th Amendment talked about electing the president and the vice president. If you remember back to when we were talking about the election of 1800, 1796, we said that the two guys that got the most electoral votes, the winner was the president, and the second place was the vice president. Problem is that usually meant that the president and the vice president were two people who didn't agree, had been running a campaign against each other, and that makes for an awkward work environment. So, what we want to do with the 12th Amendment is say, look, we're going to elect the president and the vice president together. And so that's why at the conventions and things that we see, the president and the vice president are put on the ticket so you know who it is you're voting for both offices. That changes with the 12th Amendment, so we don't have any more of that awkwardness. 13, 14, and 15 are the Civil War amendments, or the Reconstruction amendments, or the Civil Rights amendments. Depends on how you want to look at it. These happen right after, in the 5 years following the Civil War. The 13th is going to end slavery in the United States. So that question that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson kind of punted down the road is finally answered with the 13th Amendment. Those three mentions of slavery in the Constitution itself are now null and void because we don't have slavery in the United States anymore. The 14th Amendment defines who is a citizen of the United States. It talks about equal protection under the law. And the 14th Amendment is going to be one that comes up a ton, especially when we start talking about the judicial branch. That one's going to be in there, and we'll talk about that one a lot more. The 15th Amendment gives black men the right to vote, so it extends the right to vote to any male citizens. Sorry, ladies, you're going to have to wait a couple of more slides before the right to vote is extended to you. But those are basically the 5 years following the end of the Civil War. We see those things. Being passed. The 16th Amendment is one that, as you grow up, you may not like a whole lot. It is income tax. Now, this one comes in the 19 teens, so it was a really long time in between the 15th Amendment and the 16th Amendment. They tried to get this passed several different times in our history. They made laws that said this, and the Supreme Court struck them down. And so they come back and basically said, yeah, we can charge taxes on income. So the government wasn't going to be relying on tariffs and other things to be able to have the money to function. Now, income tax, we have a gradual or progressive income tax, which means the more money you make, the more you pay in taxes. That's usually around election time, something that gets very controversial. You'll have people looking at other people saying, well, he or she's going to raise our taxes. I remember there was a presidential candidate in 2016 that talked about just making what he called a flat tax, that he wanted everybody to pay the same percentage of their income in taxes. And so it's something we all got to deal with. April 15th comes for all men. It's kind of nice, though, when you think about it, because when you're young, the way you guys are, usually if you've got a job, you're going to get most of that money back that you've paid in taxes. You pay a pretty small amount, and as you start to have to pay more in taxes, that just means you're making more money. So you're playing the game you're supposed to be playing, right? You're playing it well. That's the 16th Amendment. The 17th Amendment provides for the popular election of senators. And so senators, if you remember, we were talking about the Constitution, were elected by state legislatures. The only directly elected part of the federal government were the House of Representatives. Well, this amendment changes that to where instead of the state legislatures picking the senators that were going to be sent, this allowed the people to elect them. So in Indiana, it's 2020. We don't have a senator up on the ballot this year. But in 2 years, Todd Young will be going for another 6-year term. And then in another 2 years, Mike Braun will be going for a second term in the Senate, or at least I would assume those guys will be running. But we get to vote on those guys because of the 17th Amendment. The 18th Amendment is one of the more controversial in our history. You probably remember from U.S. history or American studies talking about this idea of prohibition. And prohibition You can look into the history of it a lot more. Basically, you've got some politicians who are looking for a woman's issue. They saw the 19th Amendment coming down the pike and wanted to have something they could tout so those ladies would want to vote for them. And so they give Congress the power to ban alcohol sales in the United States. It was the sale, manufacture, and production. You could drink it, but the problem was once Prohibition hit, they weren't making any more of it. And so this kicks off right at the beginning of the Roaring Twenties. It's actually going to greatly increase the number of people who are drinking. Uh, it's almost like just because it's illegal, people or more people wanted to do it. It will eventually be repealed, but not until after it has helped give birth to organized crime and NASCAR and all kinds of other fun stuff that hopefully you talked about in U.S. history. If you didn't, let me know, and I'll be glad to uh, talk with you or post a video about those things. The 19th Amendment, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary in 2020, is women's suffrage. Now, suffrage sounds like something you wouldn't want, but you do because suffrage is the right to vote. And so women are extended voting rights with the 19th Amendment. Hearing a lot of stuff these days about how women will be the key voters in the upcoming election we've got going in 2020. So it'd be interesting if you're watching this after the election of 2020 to see what kind of role women played in deciding who was going to be the next president of the United States. The 20th Amendment moved the date up when the president and the Congress took their seats in office. It used to be in March that they would take their seats. And really, that was more of a function of travel, needing to make arrangements, and needing to get places over unreliable roads, not wanting to travel in the wintertime because that would have been harder. Obviously, by the time this one is passed in the 30s, that's not as big a deal because we have paved roads and cars and trains and things like that. And so they said, look, we're having an election in November. These guys aren't taking office until March. That makes the people who have those jobs then lame ducks. And so we don't want to have any more of a lame duck period than we do. And so Congress now seats, I think it's the 3rd of January that they seat, and then the president on the 20th of January is inaugurated into office. So it crunches down that transition period between an election in November and then who's going to take over. Not necessarily a big deal unless you've got somebody who's retiring from office, you've got a president who's served 2 terms, or you have somebody who's been beat. Because if you win the office again, obviously you don't have to transition and do those sorts of things. But like I said, no more lame ducks. And I found this cute picture of a bunch of Aflac ducks that apparently have had a bad time that are walking towards the White House. 21st Amendment repealed prohibition. When Franklin Roosevelt talked about the amendment, he said the American people need a drink. And so the 21st Amendment repealed prohibition. It's a good thing. It was the Great Depression, and alcohol sales started to legally flow again. Part of the reason behind this, you can charge taxes on alcohol. So if people are already drinking it, and we know they were illegally, that's a revenue stream that the government sure could use during the Great Depression. And so they approve alcohol sales, manufacture, and transport again with the 21st Amendment. 22nd Amendment was during the late 40s, early 50s, and it was a limit on the number of terms a president could serve. If you remember, kind of the pattern had been with George Washington that you only served a maximum of 2 terms if you were elected president of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt broke that tradition um, because he's leading us through the Great Depression, can see World War II on the horizon. So he is actually elected 4 times President of the United States. The man that you see here signing the amendment is his successor. Franklin Roosevelt didn't live very long into his fourth term as president, and so Harry Truman will serve that term and then win one of his own. But they wanted to make sure, again, that you don't have anybody getting too much power, and so the idea is maximum of 8 years is all you get. I'd like to draw your attention to the fellow over the top of the right shoulder of Harry Truman. There's one of these guys in every picture of any bill signing I've ever seen. There's everybody's kind of looking at the president, and there's the one guy that I don't know if his wife is the one taking the picture or he's just mugging for the camera. But there's always a guy looking right at the camera and smiling in one of these bill signing pictures. 23rd Amendment extends um, the voting in presidential elections to the District of Columbia. So even though they don't have representatives in the Senate or the House of Representatives, they do have 3 electoral votes um, that are awarded them in a presidential election. So there are 3 votes there for Washington, D.C. So it's a little bit of representation, but it's not in the legislative branch. So if you see those license plates, they still have taxation without representation on them. But they do get a little bit of a say in the presidential election. 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes. I'm going to give you a second to take in that picture of Homer Simpson there. This is not a prohibition on um, taxes on the wages of exotic dancers. Poll taxes were fees that some states and communities were making people pay to vote in elections, and it was a way of keeping people from voting, basically keeping poor people, people of color, from voting. And Congress said, no, you're not going to do that, and so the 24th Amendment is passed. But I couldn't really make that poll tax joke unless I found something that was just funny, not inappropriate for the picture. And you'd be surprised how easy it is to find a picture of Homer Simpson pole dancing. But 24th Amendment, that's it. 25th Amendment talks about what happens when the president dies or is somehow incapacitated. And so basically this set in stone the idea that when the president dies, the vice president becomes the president of the United States. So he's got the power of the president. He then nominates and has confirmed by the Senate his own vice president to take his place or her place in office. This also talks about if a certain percentage of the cabinet, the president's group of advisors, think he is unfit or she is unfit for office, they can get together and sign a letter and actually remove the president from power. This has never happened. Probably the closest it comes is in a film called Air Force One that we're going to take a look at as when we do the executive branch. But the 25th Amendment is there. So if a president like went nuts or off their hinges, something like that, this is a way of protecting the country from that. Like I said, much more commonly used in the idea of what happens when a president dies, and just confirming that the vice president, yes, indeed, is the president with all the powers that the president has. If you look in history, people are getting tore up about that. The 26th Amendment happens in the Vietnam War era. And basically, those guys were making the argument, hey, if we're old enough to go fight in a war in the jungles of Vietnam, we should be old enough to vote. And so the 26th Amendment drops our voting age in the country from 21 to 18, which was the same age you were eligible for the draft. So this extends voting rights to 18-year-olds. Some of you listening to this may be getting ready to vote in your first election very soon because you are or will soon be 18 years old. I certainly hope that you take advantage of that right. It's very important to make our voices heard. I've always kind of gone with the adage that if I vote, then I can whine because I went and did my part, and so I can blame or praise whoever it is in office. If I didn't vote, then I shouldn't whine about it because I didn't help pick the person that was in there. So, 26th Amendment, right to vote. The last one is the 27th Amendment, and this is one that deals with congressional pay raises. We got to go back 202 years in our history to see the origins of this. This actually was proposed in the 1700s, the late 1700s, and James Madison proposed this as one of the original ideas uh, for um, for what would become the Bill of Rights. And basically, the idea was that um, Congress can't give themselves a pay raise uh, that takes effect before an election. So they can give themselves a pay raise, but there has to be an election in between the time that it's passed and the time that they get it. So basically, you can't give yourself a raise while you're on the job, which is probably a good thing because I know if I could give myself raises at the end of a particularly stellar day of teaching government, I might just go down and say, hey, you guys owe me more money. Now, this is a cool story. Stick with me because we're almost done. But in 1980, there was this college kid that wrote a paper basically saying, "Hey, this amendment was written and went out to the states in whatever 1798 or something like that. Went out to the states. It could conceivably still be passed." Because it didn't have a deadline on it. Several states had ratified it, but back in the 1700s, and he said no, this could be passed. His professor didn't agree with him and gave him a bad grade on the paper. And so this guy went out and made it his life's mission to get the 27th Amendment passed. So he started to go around the states to have them do it, and then got it passed. I couldn't find out if the professor gave him a different grade on the paper. Probably not, but the satisfaction that guy had to have felt of just taking something that far is pretty amazing. So that's how the 27th Amendment got there. There's nothing that says we can't have more amendments. Like I said, there are those two processes in Article 5 that say how that could happen. There are a couple of rumblings in the country about those. One that I was reading about was a wanting to call a convention to overturn the Citizens United decision, which, if you know anything about that, deals with money in elections and basically treats corporations like people. And so there were 5 or 6 states that have signed off on having an Article 5 convention to redo campaign finance reform. Now, 5 is well below that threshold of 38 states that you would need to agree to it. But who knows? Maybe someday in the future we have an Article 5 convention, or that there is an amendment passed for some other reason. Like I said, it is hard. I remember being a kid in the 80s, and they talked about passing an amendment on outlawing burning the flag, and that never got anywhere. In the early 2000s, there was talk of passing an amendment um, saying that marriage was between a man and a woman. That when that issue was very controversial, obviously public opinion really swung quickly on that one, and so that's a good illustration of why this process is so hard. Why you don't just want people willy nilly being able to add things into the Constitution. So there are your 11th to 27th Amendments conveniently discussed. Like I said, we'll see some more of these in the future as we go on.